demonstrating that expertise that you as family historians have, that Hamish is going to start to talk about now, about how we university historians can work with you family historians in a digital universe. Hamish has already been introduced this morning, but one of the amazing crosses to his boat is this digital expertise that he's developed in Van Diemen's Land and is now Tasmania. We all live in the past, and is now bringing to New South Wales. Are we all tacked up?
I think we are.
Fabulous. Over to you, Hamish.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. Now, I'm going to rely very heavily on slides. So I'm going to sit down so that I don't obscure the screen. Let me know if you can't hear me or want me to stand up so that you can see me more. So as Tamsin has indicated, I'm a little bit obsessed with convicts. Not because they're convicts, but because they are so well described. Now, before I elaborate on that, I have to actually make some acknowledgements. I actually represent about 100 people. I can't do what I do without the help of the organisations that are up on the screen at the moment. And I particularly want to acknowledge the indefatigable Female Convict Research Centre, which has just been a snowplow in terms of not just digitising records, but driving the principles through which they should be fitted together and curated. And I'll talk more about that. But also the Tasmanian archives have been just absolutely fantastic. And I work with a lot of local groups, archivists, historic sites, private companies like S-Mapping and Sentilab, which are a commercial arm based out of Monash University, and a whole host of universities, of which some of them you can see there. Now, I'm obsessed with convicts because we know the colour of their eyes, how tall they were, the tattoos and scars on their body. In many cases, we know the species of worm that infested their gut, how much money they had in their pockets when they arrived, and the names of their brothers and sisters, where they were born, and in Van Diemen's Land, and I think in the future in New South Wales, every stroke of the lash that fell across their backs, every day that they spent in solitary confinement, where they died, how long they lived, how many children they had. Now, I'm interested in those kind of questions because increasingly one of the things I try to do is to really impact upon people the way in which the past affects the present. One of the ways of doing that is to demonstrate the power of intergenerational transmission. I think these, particularly for a country like Australia, these are very important questions. When we start to think about why we can't close the gap, part of the reason is because of things that happened 2 or 3, 4, 5 perhaps generations ago. And I think it's beholden upon us to look at those issues. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of things, questions that I'm fascinated by. One is intergenerational prosecution risk. So if one or more of your parents has been convicted, the chances that you will be convicted go through the roof. Now, there are at least 4 different mechanisms driving this. Oh, and I should say that I wrote this paper in Keynote, and we've had to translate it into PowerPoint, and at times the fonts get out of skew, so just bear with me a little bit. So this is the Herald Sun explanation, poor parenting, and we got lots of evidence for it. So the impact that your parents, or the time that parents spend with children really does matter. We also know that there is a genetic component. And we think this is quite small, but obviously disorders like Brugmann's disease and schizophrenia do run in families. And of course, it's an unfortunate reality that the mentally ill are massively overrepresented in our prison population. But we also know that shared environmental experiences are very important. So if you are brought up in the same crimogenic, deprived suburb as your parents, it may not be the parents that are influencing your chances of being arrested. It's that you're brought up in the same neighbourhood of Liverpool, like Toxteth or somewhere like that. And now finally, and this is one I think is very difficult for us to get our heads around, but it's there and it's quite an important factor, is that the police doing their job increases the risk of this type of phenomenon. So what do the police do? When they get a report of a crime, they go out and round up the usual suspects. It's the Casablanca effect, for those of you who can remember that movie. And of course, if they know that members of your family have been arrested, they will target you. So you're less likely to get away with a crime if you've got a history of familial offending. Just because, so the police reinforce this effect. And that has enormous financial implications, because it means it's more difficult for some families to break out of crime circles. So that's one of these factors. Now let's go to the intergenerational transmission of health inequalities. This one's terrifying. So we know that the genetic factor is in play there. It's much smaller than most of us think. Environmental factors play a huge role. So the lead, for example, that we absorb, lead exposure is very heavily correlated with violent crime. Terrifying, but true. We also know that there's some incredible social mechanisms. If your mother could read and write, you're likely to live longer. If your grandmother is in the household of birth, you're likely to live longer, especially if it's your mother's mother. It doesn't matter that much if it's your father's mother. Get your head around that. So we have literacy records for convicts. So we can do this kind of work with convict records. Now, the two really frightening ones are the fetal origins hypothesis, which was first postulated in the 1990s, and we've now got a huge amount of evidence to support this, is that we were created when our grandmothers grew up, because our grandmothers had the egg that became our mothers inside her. And so the notion is that, that we are still, we inherit our grandmother's genetic programming. And look, she was the conditions, let me put this around the other way, that we are programmed to expect the conditions that our grandmother encountered. And when we don't, things go wrong. So when you are born not into a land of scarcity, but a land of plenty, then your chances of getting type 2 diabetes and your cardiovascular risk increases. And this is a way of explaining why somewhere like Glasgow has poor health outcomes now that cannot be explained by things like smoking and drinking. I mean, those are factors, but when you control for those, it's still got a health risk. And so maybe it's the legacy of the past. It's what happened to your grandmother's health that's important. Now, there's an even more scary one. If that wasn't scary enough, chemical coating of chromosomes. Now, we know this from Holocaust survivors, that the traumas that they were exposed to were also displayed by their children who were conceived and born after the event. Now, we know that you can chemically coat chromosomes because of traumatic experiences, and then these can be passed down to generations. So in other words, that tatty chromosomes are a part of our history. This is not genetic. This is determined socially and environmentally. It's policy that makes a difference here. What fascinates me about this is you can't study any of this in a lab unless you want to work with mice. If you want to work with human populations, you've got to go to the archive. And Australia is one of the best places to get intergenerational data sets going back 6 generations because of those convicts who are so well described. So that's a little bit of background on me. So now this is what the organization that I put together or helped to put together has managed to do over the last 12 years. We've assembled, it's now just over 1.7 million digitized Tasmanian records. We started with the convict indents and the description records and the conduct records. And then we've gone backwards into Britain and Ireland and started to transcribe Hulk records, jail records. And then we've gone forwards to look at permission to marry, musters, records of absconders, court records, passes, records of pass holders. You don't have those here because that was a probation era thing that happened in Tasmania, but every convict had to enter into a contract. So this is what replaced the assignment system. And we have those contracts in Tasmania, so we know which master every convict was working for, how long they signed the contract for, and how much they got paid. Tremendous record. We have the certificates of freedom. We know the names of every convict who was appointed to the police and when they were dismissed. We are very lucky in that Tasmania was the second place in the British Empire to get civil registration of births, deaths and marriages. It happened in 1838, 1 year after England and Wales. Because of the fantastic Tasmanian Archives Act, all of that data has been digitised and is publicly available. So universities played a big role in helping that to come about. We've managed to keep the data set alive. So we have all births, deaths and marriages until from 1838 to 1899, a whole heap of a whole heap of ecclesiastical records as well. We also have the deaths, Tasmanian deaths now up until 1928, and grant applications in to try and extend that to 1978 when the current electronic series takes over. And if we manage to pull that one off, Tasmania will have the longest run of digitised death certificates in the English-speaking world. Hurrah. And we've also got pauper records, police gazette records, property valuations, and the attestation papers for the 15,500 Tasmanian-born who served in the First World War. So we've got the makings here of an intergenerational data set. But the way that we've done this is really, I think, really quite interesting. It's been done as a partnership with the Tasmanian Archives and with local and family history groups. And I'll talk more about that at lunchtime and this afternoon. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just introduce you to some of the Tasmanian records and look at 4 things we've done with them. So the first is I'm going to take you on a little micro story because people like micro stories. So to see what we can do with one entry. So this is the kind of stuff that Meg does. This is, novelist territory. So there'll still be gaps in the record, but we can start to, I think, speculate a little bit on what's going on. Then I want to do bird's eye view, same record set, but what does everything look like? And then I'm going to concentrate on women because women are much, much more important than men. And I'm going to look at the impacts of solitary confinement on life expectancy for women. And then I'm going to end by looking at colonial growth patterns, so how tall and short people are. So 4 very different things. This is a conduct record. They did exist once for New South Wales, but unfortunately the central series is no longer with us. But I'm told that there are the records that contributed to the drawing up of these records. Now, obviously you can't read what's there, so let's bring in so this is a conduct record typed out for a 16-year-old convict called William Gow. He's a collier's boy from just south of Glasgow. And if you take that first entry there, May the 16th, 1832, it says Murray, that's the master he's assigned to. And what you've got here is a summary of a magistrate's bench encounter. So originally there would have been a full court record for this. So it says gross insolence, and then it's got the sentence, 25 lashes and return to his master. And then the J. Simpson is James Simpson, that's the magistrate who heard the case. So a lot of summarized information there. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that this convict ends up, he has a lot of charges brought by Murray against him. He ends up in a road party. He's actually charged at one stage with inciting his fellow prisoners to insubordination and refusing to work. And so I'll expand on that a little bit more, but it looks like it's a potential gang strike. And then the conduct record ends with the Lieutenant Governor's been pleased to grant this man a free pardon and 50 sovereigns for his praiseworthy conduct in apprehending Benjamin Ball, a bushranger of desperate character. Now, what I like about this is that we can kind of look at a record like this over the kind of schema of the convict system. So here we've got the gallows down at one end and then penal stations like Port Macquarie, and then we're ending up with absolute pardon up the top. And of course, there's a female version of this as well. So this is David Gow's progress through the convict system in 30 seconds. He arrives, he's assigned, he goes to a road party, he's assigned, he goes to a road party, then back to a chain gang, then to a road party, down back to a chain gang, he's assigned, he goes to a road party, then he goes to a chain gang, then he captures a bushranger and he gets out. I'd like to do that by special request. He arrives, he's assigned, he goes to a road party, he's assigned, he goes to a road party, then to a chain gang, then to a road party, then to a chain gang, then he's assigned, then he goes down to a road party, then a chain gang, then he captures a bushranger and he gets out. Because I'm a maniac, I'd like to do that for all 73,000 convicts that we have contact records for. We're very close to being doing it, to being able to do it for all 13,500 female convicts. Very, very exciting. 73,000 magistrates' bench encounters by those women, all transcribed, all coded, all locked into step, and we've got 3 research teams at the moment just working on putting the pieces together to be able to do those kind of visualizations. So this is the micro story. I picked this convict for no other reason than he's got a spectacular set of tattoos and a good background story, which I won't tell you about. That's for another day. This is what's on his conduct record. We have 4 entries, and it's the first one which I'm going to concentrate on. So that's the only one I'll read out. So 26th of July, 1833, while assigned to a man named Parker, gross insubordination, also assaulting his master and violently beating and assaulting his fellow servant. Original sentence extended 2 years and recommended to be sent to a penal station. He doesn't look like somebody you want to go for a drink with. That looks like a really, really badass. And in fact, it's quite common for descendants of convicts to say, my convict was really bad. He may have been, but I want to try and put a bigger context around that little bit of the story. Now, we can start to do this through record linkage. So here, let's bring in, here we have this was posted in the newspaper, but it's a transfer between properties. So we've done this for every newspaper record that's in this series has now been pushed in with these transcripts of conduct records. These are 3 surviving muster records. Now what I can do is actually reconstruct his employment history. We can now move him around on a map, but I can go one stage further. So we know that the Parker that he's assigned to is Mr. Thomas Parker at Norfolk Pains, and that the Thomas Parker's house is Southwest Cottage near Longford. They're all his fellow workers. So I'm going to go on a quest and see if I can find out who he violently assaulted. I can't quite get there, but I think there's a pretty good indication who it is. Now, I suspect that the next slide is a little bit mangled, but let's see how we go. First thing I can do is that I can work out the background on that property, because I know who's there and how they're punished. So this is the flogging rate on that property over time. So that gross misconduct case happens at that point. Now, it's not an isolate. 4 convicts are charged at the same time. So Edward Kennedy gets the book thrown at him, and he gets 2 years in a penal station, but George Cornish gets 1 year in a road gang, and Charles Pizzey gets 50 lashes. The 4th convict, John French, is acquitted. So there's a kind of interesting story there. Now we can go back and look at the record on that property. Before we do that, let's spend a little time with Charles Pizzey. It's an unusual name. He's actually a transported swing rioter. So he was transported for participating in the 1830 swing riot. He's got a political background. When his back is healed from the 50 lashes, he gets back on the property. I reckon that the intervening time, he would have been away in the watch station in Longford. But on the 8th of August, 1833, he's tried for violently assaulting his fellow servant. Again, the fellow servant is not named. I suspect very strongly it's the same person that Edward Kennedy has a go at. The coincidence is very strong. So now let's go back and look at some of the other incidents on the property. We have another collective action in the sense that multiple convicts try for the same offence in November 1831. Another very interesting one in January 1832, which is a bit of a diversion, but let's read this. It's absent without leave for improper purposes. It's Jane Boulter, the one female convict. And because we've matched all the records up, William Courtney's are tried with her. These 2 convicts are emotionally attached. And let's just think about this. Improper purpose? It's only an improper purpose because sex has been criminalized. And I think for family historians, that's really, really interesting. And now if we go on another step, we've got several convicts being charged for absent without leave. So of course the interesting thing here is that John French comes up again and again and again, and he's in with this thing. He's acquitted. Is it possible that he tried to save his bacon this time round, and that Edward Kennedy had a go at him for that, and that's why Edward Kennedy got 2 years rather than 1? And is it possible that Charles Pizzey had a go at the same convict? Well, we won't know, but interestingly, if you read down John French's record, it ends with awarded a free pardon for materially contributing to the capture of the bushrangers Jefferson Conway. So he actually has form for dobbing. So it's in Meg's territory to make that connection. As a historian, I can't be sure, but I can hint very heavily at it. Anyway, now let's go to the micro record. So we built this up using a 4% sample of the male conduct records. So this is the amount of time, on average, convicts spent in chains and at hard labour on the roads of Van Diemen's Land over time. So you can see its wavelength. In a moment, I'll give you the total figure. It's frightening. But its wavelength, and it gets bigger. So we look for things that might be driving that. This is the cost of rationing a convict. And so what we're suggesting is as the costs go up, the master has a word with the magistrate, and the magistrate is more inclined to sentence the convict to a road gang, so the government is paying the increased costs. And during that time, a free worker is being hired. When the reverse happens, the court actually acts as a hiring and firing mechanism. So what's happening on your conduct record is, of course, reflecting the character of the convict, but it's also reflecting the labour market conditions in the colony. You're not supposed to see that, because the focus is on the individual. It's only by digitising the whole lot and bringing it together. Now, does this matter, or is it Hamish just waffling on? Well, no, hell, it matters. There's the death record. So it's impacting upon survival chances. So if we go on a little bit further, one of the things that I find terrifying about convict records, and I see I'm going to have to speed up a little bit, is that the prosecution risk for women was greater than for men. In fact, down here I've summarised the total number, so nearly 1.5 million lashes in strokes to the lash in Van Diemen's Land alone. I think we can comfortably say in Australia as a whole, there are over 3 million strokes to the lash were administered. And in Van Diemen's Land, nearly 20 million days hard labour performed by male and female convicts in Van Diemen's Land alone. But if you look at the solitary confinement exposure, the average male spent 9 days in solitary confinement. The average for a woman was nearly 21 days, average. Now, I can tell you that 50% of female convicts never experienced the inside of a solitary cell. So the other 50% are getting multiple exposure. So we're just completing a study on whether that impacted upon life expectancy. So to do this, you've got to link thousands of female convicts to a death certificate. So we've managed to do this for nearly half of all of the female convicts. So here are the results. So this is the life expectancy for convicts who are aged 20 to 29, female convicts 20 to 29 on arrival in Australia who never experienced the inside of a solitary cell as far as interrogation with their conduct record reveals. Now, what's going on here? At that point, 100% are alive. Here, 75% are alive. Here, 50%, they're 25%. And at that point, they're all dead. And the bottom axis is how many years they've spent in Van Diemen's Land. So now I'm going to plot a similar curve for those who experience solitary confinement. There it is. Every day in solitary confinement knocks 10 days off your life expectancy. Now, we've also got indications as well that it affects your fertility. So this is really frightening stuff. And just think about those intergenerational implications now. So just finally, this is my final example. These are growth curves. Green here is girls, blue is boys. This is cross-sectional data. It's all of the heights recorded on arrival. So, obviously the 10-year-olds are much shorter than the 28-year-olds. So we're trying to peer into growth patterns in the past, looking at this data. And the 3 things I've highlighted here. The first one is the point in which boys overtake girls again. So this is to do with the timing of the adolescent growth spurt. It's really important because it affects fertility. So it's a thing that family historians need to know about. 2 is the curious way in which the men in particular in this chart appear not to reach adult height until their late 20s. Now, deprived populations will do this. The body will continue to, currently, almost everybody reaches adult height by 19. But there are indications in the past this didn't happen. And the third is something which unfortunately affects us over the age of 40. We start to get shorter. So what this is produced by one of my postgraduate students. This is a height heat map. So blue is shorter than average and red is taller than average. So this illustrates the impact of the Industrial Revolution on convict growth patterns, really well. But we can control for where you're born and do all kinds of other fabulous stats in order to try and work out whether we've got, whether the convicts that arrived in Australia as teenagers and were put on a pound of meat actually managed to attain more of their biologically programmed height than the older shipmates who had reached adult height when they arrived. And the reason why I'm showing this picture of the Coalition of the Willing first time round, this is the troops that went to the Boxer Uprising, is to highlight that very tall United States and Australian, this is New South Wales Marine, what are they called? New South Wales, anyway, it was the contingent sent from here. You can see how much taller they are than the Europeans. So if we take a record like Edward Perkins, for example, Edward Perkins was aged 18 on arrival, and we've reconstructed his entire life history here. So, all the way through, there's a picture of him, photographed in 1891. But all of those red dots towards the end are jail records where we have another height for him. So we have a height when he was 18, and we have a height in old age. Now we can do some really clever stats, and we can allow for his shrinking in old age, and then try and work out whether Edward Perkins and other convicts like him who arrived as teenagers grew taller than they would have done otherwise because of encountering colonial conditions. So did the British send them to a sunny paradise? Yes, and better air, and all of those kind of things. And the upshot is, and this is just hot off the press, is that we've got 2,500 male convicts where we have a height on arrival and a later height when they're rearrested, and only 500 women. So we're on the hunt for more female data. But this is what the data shows. So the females are down the bottom, and I've put that dotted line, the curved line I put through, is indicating where we think the female data is taking us. So the summary of this is that if you're a male convict and you arrive as a teenager, current data is showing you never catch up. You're permanently stunted. Now, this could be because they were always more disadvantaged than other convicts, but it could also be the way that male convicts are treated in the convict system here further inhibits their growth. Female convicts, however, small number of cases, but we've just got the early indications that they're responding very differently. And this may be because they're useful, because they're sent out as, to settlers as servants, and they're put on the pound of meat a day, rather than the boys who are going to the Carter's barracks and Point Pure. And the final slide here, and then I'll shut up, I promise, is bringing New South Wales to the party on this particular question because of the ticket of leave butts, which we do not have in Tasmania. So everybody says the Tasmanian records are better than the New South Wales records. I'm skeptical. I reckon that New South Wales has as many gems as Van Diemen's Land. It's just that we haven't gone through them and put them all together and linked them up, and they're distributed all over the place. But the New South Wales ticket of leave butts have a height on release from the convict system. So for a convict who's measured on arrival, who's an adolescent, we will have an adult measurement on exit. And what's more, it won't be this ultra subpopulation of people who've been reconvicted later on. It'll be more representative of all convicts. And I will shut up at that point. Thank you very much. Do you want to stand up now?
Any questions for Hamish?
I mistakenly assumed that was only mirroring the indent information and added the ticket of leave number. I never thought that the information about the actual convict was new. So I'm going to have to go backwards now and find my convicts.
I've only been able to check the odd record, and I've seen differences.
Yeah, there is differences.
But it may well be true that the whole batch is that they're just copied across. So we'll never know this without being detectives and actually going in and looking. And I've got no idea how many ticket of leaves have the height filled out or not, whether it's common or really rare.
No, it's not on every one.
Yeah.
It's on quite a few, but it's not on every one. You know, other people can tell you different, but yeah. Now, if you'd like to hear more from Hamish and Perry, they are coming to our conference in September. So I'm hoping that you have already booked in.
Oh, she's good.
Hi, Hamish. The height that's recorded across all the records, starting from the index right through the ticket of leave to certificate of freedom, is there a consistency in it? Are you finding there are variations? Like, I wonder, how did they actually do the measuring? Like, particularly places like Port Macquarie, did they have a ruler somewhere where they were able to do this? But I sort of wonder about that. Are you finding any inconsistencies, major inconsistencies in that? I use that.
Short answer is yes. I mean, you would expect there to be inconsistencies because the heights are taken to the nearest quarter inch at best, so there's rounding. But in fact, we know that heights are more likely recorded to the nearest inch. So the quarter inch and half inches are less common. So when you think about that, if you're recording to the nearest inch, you would expect a variation of an inch between heights because somebody might round up and somebody else might round down. Now, this is really scary, but we can differ by as much as an inch in height in a day.
Yeah.
We're at our tallest when we get up. But yeah. Now, there is a big issue with shoes as well. We think that the Police Gazette records that we're using have got shoes in them, because we detect a little bit of a difference between the... now, those variations shouldn't matter if they are random. So they go. So one of the differences between the way I work and the way family historians work is that a little bit of noise in my data is okay. A bit of noise in the family tree is a disaster. And that's one of the things that we have to bear in mind. Most things we use very similar methods, but for family historians, will at times need more accurate data than a historian like me can cope with. So there's a lot of mess, Rex, but we think that we're still getting a really clear picture.
Thanks, Hamish.
Just still on the same subject, what about complexion? Because that's not, I'm just trying to wonder whether in New South Wales, in this office, they might call someone Ruddy, but down in Tasmania, they might call them Ginger. I'm not really sure. What about complexion?
Yes. Now, that's a very, very apt question. So we have 60 volunteers that work with us, which I'm always extraordinarily grateful for their time and energy. One of them, Jodie, has just been working with me to construct a classification system for complexion. So we actually think very carefully about those questions. And we have two scales, so one tries to collapse things together and the other one keeps them apart. So we put kind of like florid and ruddy in one, and then we separated them later on. And the reason for doing this is that to do stats on something, we need a smaller number of categories. But in order to interrogate the data properly, we need to also look at the different, the different subcategories that make something up. But to answer your question, for the first time, we will be able to hook out records by their recorded complexion and see if there's systematic differences between, like, are the ones that arrive in winter more likely to be described as sour, for example. And the other reason for doing it is to spot, of course, convicts that are of non-European descent. So they're not always put down as a man of colour. So look, it's going to be very, very exciting to work with that data.
If I could just make a comment on that, it's not their arrival, that they look like they've been on a ship for 2 or 3 months, so it's...
Yes. Yes. We're having a lot of fun at the moment, so this is a kind of rider to it. There's a lot of fun with, we got a lot of data out of the Hulk records and from Millbank and Grange Gorman, where people are described before they get on the vessel. and then we match that with a description on arrival. So you can compare across the two and see how answers to questions change. That's really revealing. The bottom line is that there is an enormous amount of correlation across the two records, but the discrepancies tell you things that you wouldn't, like they reinforce that there's education on board the vessel. So there's systematic increase in literacy scores. When you drill down into it, they're affected by things like the sickness rate on the vessel. So if a lot of people fall sick on the vessel, the lift in learning is less, presumably because the surgeon is not able to run stores efficiently. So when you're drilling down into that kind of a level, it gives you a lot of faith in the quality of the data. And it's also taught us to get back to the complexion question. Every scrap of data that you will be able to find something, you get a meaningful result out there if you're forensic in the way that you code it and use it.
Any other questions or comments?
And when do you start? On New South Wales convicts?
That's going to be my question too.
It's underway.
So, from here I go to Armidale, where I'm hoping to sign my new employment contract. I've already seen the KPIs, and one of the KPIs is to do what I've done for Tasmania, for Van Diemen's Land. Oh, sorry. So do what I've done for VDL for New South Wales. Now, that's a bit embarrassing because I can't do that. I can only do it in conjunction with people like you. That's just the reality. So the question of when we start on New South Wales is a question collectively for us, not just for me.
Well, actually, I'm wondering if it's a question that we will take this afternoon when we have our round table, so that we can all be involved in talking about how we envisage the next steps, the launch.
I think that that's actually really, really important. One of the things I've emphasised again and again and again is that in order to get a large statewide project done, it needs to be done democratically, which means that there needs to be rules, and there needs to be everybody has a voice. I don't want to be engaged in a system where somebody who volunteers their time is treated as an inferior citizen because they don't have a professor in front of them. So it's quite a lot of preparation to do, but yes, it is possible to start on. Well, in fact, people have been starting on New South Wales for a very long time. I think it is possible to actually bring all of those starts together and see something quite remarkable quite quickly if we're organised. I think that's incredibly exciting.
Well, thank you so much. I've known Hamish for years and years, but he still astonishes me with the breadth of his knowledge of the unique Australian archive. So thank you very much, Hamish.